Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, Professor of Brazilian History and Culture at Brown University and the National Co-Coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is supported by the Washington, Brazil office. This is Brazil Unfiltered. Today I have the honor of interviewing João Carlos Jarochinski Silva, who has a PhD in social sciences from the Catholic University of São Paulo and a postdoctorate studies from the Center for Population Studies at the State University of Campinas, Unicamp. He's a professor of international relations and in the master's program in society and borders at the Federal University of Roraima. He was a visiting scholar at the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies at American University, and his research topics relate to human mobility since 2007. João Carlos, welcome to Brazil Unfiltered.
Hi, James. Welcome.
So, first of all, what is the main situation of immigrants into Brazil today? Could you give us a sense of the numbers and where they're coming from and to what extent they're integrated into Brazilian society?
Okay. James, as everybody knows, Venezuelans are the biggest nationality of migrants in Brazil, but Haitians have also been a significant group, especially since 2010. In recent years, the number of migrants and refugees in Brazil has increased, as has the diversity of nationalities arriving in the country. However, the total number remains well below the global average, and the Venezuelans and the Haitians continue to stand up as the most prominent groups. These nationalities experience distinct integration process. In the case of the Venezuelans, because of the Operation Welcome, Operation Acolhida, Venezuelan migrants and refugees have settled across almost the entire national territory. Through the official relocation program in Portuguese, interiorização, more than 1,000 cities have received Venezuelans. Brazil has like 50,000 cities. Additionally, because of their extensive interaction with the authorities, Venezuelans tend to assess their rights more frequently and seek social benefits as indicated by social resist data. More than 50% of the Venezuelans receive social benefits now. Their spread distribution across Brazil, combined with their ability to communicate in Spanish, facilitate their interactions with the host communities, as the language barrier is somewhat lower compared to other migrant groups. Haitians, on the other hand, are primarily integrated into the labor market, engaging in wealth income generation activities, but often remain invisible to public policies. It's so different in terms of nationalities, the answers of the Brazilian government. Many adopt social invisibility as a survival strategy, ensure a secure and stable stay in the country. It's a strategy. It's difficult to say that, but it's a strategy. In addition to the greater linguistic distance between the Haitian Creole and Portuguese compared to Spanish, Haitians frequently report experience of racial discrimination, which further alienates them from certain segments of the Brazilian society. Other nationalities also deserve attention, such as Bolivians, Colombians, and even individuals from the United States. However, the growing arrival is so important in political terms of Cubans. However, these groups have a longer history of migration to Brazil than Haitians and Venezuelans, and then not with the same number in the last years. The numbers in Brazil is like 1.5 million, less than 2 million people, and this is like 1% of our population. It's a very...
And about half of that would be Venezuelans, approximately about 1 million Venezuelans?
No, we talk in terms of 600,000 to 700,000 Venezuelans. But Brazil now is a transit country to these Venezuelan people. We receive more than 1 million Venezuelans, but part of them return to Venezuela, and part use Brazil as transit to go to Europe, to go to Chile, to go to Argentina, and other countries.
Mm-hmm. So, immigration has become a key issue of the far right in campaigns in the United States and in Europe. which is not the case for Brazil. We see in Europe the real xenophobia against immigrants from Africa, from areas of the Middle East, and you don't. And in the United States, many immigrants from Central America, Mexico, and other parts of the world. Why is there not the same far-right campaign in Brazil against immigrants coming into the country?
James, there are several factors in this issue. Some of them historical, such as the construction of the idea of nation based in Gilberto Freire's thesis, in which miscegenation is value reinforcing like the Lusotropicalism perspective that developed the point where Brazil established itself as a racial democracy. Although this concept has historical certain affirmative policies deny the existence of the phenomenon such as racism, particularly in its structural terms, since opposition, this is used to opposition to affirmative policies in one of the key elements for the Brazilian far right. They want to cut these policies, affirmative policies in Brazil, mainly because they believe these policies undermine meritocracy. The people talk a lot of meritocracy here in Brazil. The far right use a lot this word, and creation social tensions that, in their view, do not exist. There's need to maintain a discourse that emphasizes racial mixing. However, this narrative does not align, as you say, with the everyday reality, where numerous instances of racism and xenophobia continue to occur. I think the people remember some years ago an episode in Rio de Janeiro about xenophobic and violence against a migrant from Africa. Moreover, in many regions of Brazil where the far right holds significant political influence, local identities are often shaped by the glorification of the historical migration. Historical in terms of the 19th and 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century. A recent example is the statement by the governor of Santa Catarina. I don't know if you see this news.
So that's a state in the southern part of Brazil, which
Yeah.
has a large European immigrant population.
A lot of most of them came from German and Italy, and in a city, the city, a small city, Pomerode, the name of the city, with German people came from Pomerania and German, of course. The government emphasized the city distinction, the city success is based on skin color, reinforcing the notion that European immigration is the defining characteristic of the region. This differs from migration patterns in the US, where integration to the new country has been more solidified, reinforcing a sense of belonging to the white American group at the expense of the original national identities. To illustrate this, James, I remember a photo, with my memory serves me correctly, of Robert De Niro, Italian name, of course, the famous actor, wearing Irish customs for St. Patrick's Day. I find it symbolic to think on an Italian American dressed for a celebration, an Irish celebration that has become part of the American culture. Of course, sorry, but ironically, he later starred the Irishman to use this. Returning to the topic, sorry, but this is a symbol in my mind. Returning to the topic of migration in Brazil, we've been told there's an idealized appreciation of historical migration. This narrative creates difficulty for an straight attack of current migration flows, especially when this migration proves beneficial to certain sectors that are relevant to the far right. First, international migration to Brazil is predominantly composed of Venezuelan nationals. But other nationalities are also interested of this political group, such as Cubans. I say these two nationalities in my first answer. The fact that these migrants came from two leftist regimes allowed their reception to be used as a political tool in domestic issues, where images of people entering Brazil are showcased along with their testimonials about the hardship they faced in Venezuela, in Cuba, in their cultures. As a result, migration policies are used to attack leftist regimes and the political left in general. We start to use this is important to think in some migration policies during the Bolsonaro's era. This context helps to explain why Bolsonaro years Operation Welcome or Acolhida. I don't know if we prefer Acolhida or Welcome, but the name is Operation Acolhida, was maintained, and there was a significant increase in the number of people recognized as refugees. It's so difficult for some people. How in the Jair Bolsonaro years, the number of refugees increased? Increased because they use the refugee recognition in a political perspective, because the numbers of refugees in Brazil increase a lot. The most part of them are Venezuelans.
If I may, I mean, I think was a typical pattern in the United States, whereas there were general restrictions, theoretical descriptions, legal restrictions on immigration. Cuban Americans, people from Vietnam after the end of the war, then later people from Venezuela were very much welcomed in Florida, especially, whereas other immigrant groups were not at all welcome. That's changed under Trump right now, but there was a period of time where there was a differentiation between people coming from left-wing or so-called left-wing countries and people coming from other parts of Latin America in terms of how they were received in the United States.
Yeah, the decision in terms of Venezuelans in Brazil, of course, for Cubans changed a lot from Dilma's government to Bolsonaro, Temer and Bolsonaro's government. But for the Venezuelans, he used the Cartagena Declaration to receive these people as people came from a country in a human rights crisis and things like this. It's interesting to recognize these people as refugees. The people are leaving their country because their country has leftist regimes. Other interesting perspective in terms of the Venezuelan case is highlight the crucial role played by the armed forces in the reception and shelter and everything, which serves as an addition factor to stopping criticism of the initiatives being implemented. For far right, they don't want to create this fight against armed force. And armed forces use a lot this reception in terms of propaganda. It's incredible. If you see the old posts in Instagram or in Twitter of the Operação Acolhida, you can see the use as a message. Venezuela, the regime of Venezuela do the thing the people live, and Brazil reception. It's very interesting to see.
Sounds like it also sounds like it gives a justification for the military to have a purpose. It's not only protecting its borders against drug trafficking, which is the argument, but also to, in a humanitarian way, receive victims of repression and therefore having a positive role as being people who are contributing to Brazilian society in a positive way by receiving Venezuelan immigrants. So I'd say it plays into a kind of a crisis in the armed force in Brazil to justify its existence to a certain extent.
Yeah, I think we can discuss this in other part, but I think it's a crisis in all the armed forces around the world. What the whole developed by the armed forces. But in terms of Brazil, coming back to discuss the difficulty far right to criticize the migration policy, in Brazil, current employment landscape, key sectors of the country's GDP, such as agribusiness, construction, face difficulties in meeting workers for their labor demands, particularly of lower paying jobs. It's very interesting to think in terms of the use of migration. This is due to several factors, include including a lack of interest from the local residents in performing certain types of work. It's so strong, like in Santa Catarina or in the south of the country. A situation exacerbated by low unemployment rates that provide works more options. Today, our employment rates are down. Additionally, we have, it's important to discuss, demographic trends are shaping labor supply, especially in certain where the agribusiness is concentrated. The region in the south of Brazil has been experiencing population aging and significant decline in fertility rates in previous decades, reducing the number of younger workers, the people with accepted lower incomes. Consequently, many migrants' policies focus on labor market integration with the islands, with the needs of these important economic sectors. When I discuss the relocation program in Brazil, is this: you get the Venezuelan people here in the border and put these people in Santa Catarina, Paraná, and other states to work.
How does that system work? How does that system work in terms of deciding where people go? Is it that the local governors or the local mayors ask for specific numbers of people, or is the federal government just deciding arbitrarily?
No, sometimes we have a integration discussed because some mayors are interested, like Chapecó in Santa Catarina. It's a medium city in Santa Catarina with a lot of agribusiness companies. They want to receive, but normally the companies want to contract these workers. You have in Operation Acolhida, you have a guy from JBS, GBS company inside the Operation Acolhida to choose some workers for their factories around Brazil.
So, and JBS is a meat processing company, among other things. So they
One
would
of the
be
biggest of the
hiring
world.
people to work in their meat packing plants around the country.
Yes, imagine inside the Operation Acolhida, you have this combination between the public policies and the interests of this company and the sectors. Finally, James, I'm sorry for this long answer. It's well understood by these political groups that immigration to Brazil is not significant in numerical terms. 1% is not significant. The presence is low, and in contrast, a lot of Brazilians live in other countries. We expect like 4.5 or 5 million Brazilians in other countries around the world. And other problems, we must also recognize that the controlling mobility across Brazilian borders with 10 other nations, the Brazilian border, unbelievable in terms of 10 countries where we have these borders. It's impossible to control this movement because it's so expensive, and we can't. Great part of this border are in the forest. It's difficult to think in a control in these borders, and extremely high cost if they want to create a perspective of control. Similarly, for this arriving Brazil by air, and I think in terms of airports, the expenses associated with travel, it's expensive to travel to Brazil. Along with limited work and income opportunities, the Brazil pay very low in terms of the salaries, serve as barriers to enter inside in terms of to think Brazil in the global perspective of the mobility. In recent times, it's important Brazil stay in the global dynamic of mobility in terms of a transit point, more for their policies of documentation and regularization than the opportunities in the labor market. They use Brazil like to go to US. A lot of people came from Africa or Asia and go to United States, cross South America, Central America to enter. but use Brazil as a transit port. I talk all this to define, even for the far right, advocacy for a strict border control in Brazil makes little sense.
Interesting. It's very different from other things. So, could you talked about Operação Acolhido, welcome. Could you explain a little bit more how the system works? You mentioned that people are moved out of the border area to other parts of the country, but explain a little bit more. How would you characterize Brazil's immigration policy in the last 10 years, or how does this policy work in practice?
Okay. First, Operation Acolhida is a unit case by now, okay? And the operation has three pillars. First is they say control the border, but the control is documentation. Every Venezuelan arriving in Brazil could be regularized and receive a documentation. They can enter by the resident visa or a refugee claim. They use this too, and we accept the documents from Venezuela. It's so important to discuss. The second pillar is shelter, because a lot of them are vulnerability, social vulnerability. And in the last years, we receive a lot of elderly people from Venezuela, a lot of families with just a mother, with a lot of kids. The fertility rate in Venezuela are higher than in Brazil, and created some situations with a mother with like 4 or 5 children, and this created vulnerability in terms of the entry of this person in the labor market. Because they created shelters, and in these shelters they work to relocation these people to other parts of the country to find a job. You can find a job in Roraima and go to work in this place. You can find your family. We call here a social reunion. I know someone in São Paulo, and this person will receive me. You can go there. And the last one, and you are go to a shelter for another shelter. The most vulnerable persons in the operation go this shelter by shelter. This is part of the Operation Acolhida. But I can say that Operation Acolhida is part of our immigration policies. Why I said that? Brazil, first, undergone a very important legislative, that Brazil undergone a significant legislative change with the introduction of 2017 migration law. They changed the perspective in terms of human rights. The Brazil needs created political policies for these people. A lot of changes in terms of establishment a new culture in terms of migration. It's important. It's evidence in the last 10 years, Brazil has very strong initiatives to attract, to receive Venezuelans, Haitians, Cubans, but we have a very difficult perspective and standardize, they institutionalize this politics. We do like also in the UN system, they call the good practice. We created a lot of good practice, but I can't affirm that this good practice will be the same in other situations, because we created some distinctions in terms of nationality, in terms of what your regularization inside the country. It's very difficult to think. Imagine you have a very interesting reception for Venezuelans, but other nationalities, sometimes with the same problems of these Venezuelan people, don't receive the same treatment. It's strange. Brazil created like a ad hoc perspective in terms of their initiatives. even with a new law. This is important. Other important in terms of the action, the future of the actions, like Operação Acolhida. I don't know if a lot of people came from Argentina, or this example. We will be construct another Operation Acolhida. I don't know. It's case by case, the answers of the Brazilian government. In this sense, in the last year, we have the COMIGRAR. What is COMIGRAR? National Conference on Migration, Refugee, and Stateless. The first COMIGRAR was in 2014, and the second only in 2024. And the issues are the same. We try to do the same public policies for this person. It's important to think. We don't develop a public policies in terms of migration. We don't think in migration in your national perspective. Even the legislative, imagine the last year's legislative has a very important role in the budget of the state. They has a permanent joint committee on international migration and refugees with 32 congresses, 16 from deputies and 16 senators. When you see the budget of this joint committee, is like 3 million reais to construction a public policy in terms of migration. With this perspective, and case by case, we normally support emergency cases like Operação Acolhida and don't support a more sustainable politic in terms of migration. It's not part of your program in terms of national perspective. This is interesting. And why Operation Acolhida received a lot of money? Receive a lot of money, of course, because the armed forces hold a significant play in this area.
Very interesting about this. So, could we say that Brazilians are sympathetic towards immigrants and foreigners in general?
I can't say they are sympathetic, given that there are a number of documented episodes of xenophobia and racism against migrants. Some research shows a lot of negative points of these events in the lives of a lot of migrants. I can't say that they are sympathetic. However, I can't say that Brazilians are against migration either, because a lot of surveys too, migrants report a strong sense of gratitude for the welcome and for some of the situations they have experienced. It's so interesting in terms like what I listened from the Venezuelans people. It's unbelievable. As anywhere in the world, there are people who are sympathetic to migrants for the most variety of reasons. There are those who are not necessarily sympathetic but respect the law, because xenophobia is a crime in Brazil. And there are those who have a critical view to migration and react in the wrong way. What I can say, unfortunately, is that a little knowledge about international migration and refugee in Brazil. As some opinion polls point out that the people believe like 35% of the Brazilian population are migrants.
Today, not children or
Yeah.
grandchildren of migrants. They think 35% of the population
Yes,
is migrant.
you see this in some polls. Unbelievable, why they think about it. And it's interesting to think about this, the knowledge Because international migration is not debated in Brazil from a perspective of building a national project, in discussion about the demographic issues in Brazil. We have a change perspective in terms of demographic. In terms of innovation capacity that migrants could bring to Brazil, and of course the country's image. We don't discuss this. It's as absurd as it may seem. In the late 90s and the beginning of 20th century, migration, sometimes, of course, for the worst reasons such as racism, was part of the national political debate in a more substantive way than is today. This is not a subject.
Just for our listeners, the context that with the end of slavery in 1888, many coffee plantation owners who were the most important part of the economy argued that African descendant workers were not hardworking, they weren't reliable, and therefore to strengthen the labor force, they needed to import European immigrants. And so there's a huge push to bring Italians and later Germans and other immigrants into the country to work in the coffee plantations, even bringing Japanese in after 1909. And so you have this big push in the early 20th century, late 19th century for massive immigration to fill what was considered a labor shortage, even though there were many capable Brazilians to do these jobs. There was a kind of a racism around the idea of who could work. So that was part of, as you said, the national debate. It was very important. And yet today it's not. Interesting.
Yeah. This is a small
So
part. Imagine 10 years to a conference to discuss national policy. It's
interesting.
unbelievable.
So in the United States, Trump has deported his, part of his electoral campaign and what he promised after coming to office, his first day in office was to do massive deportations, which has included Brazilians. There are maybe 1.8 million, maybe more Brazilians in the United States. Perhaps 500,000 are undocumented. Many of those were people who come from the lower middle class and actually supported Bolsonaro, and Bolsonaro won among Brazilian voters and many of the polling places in the United States. Um, on the other hand, Lula has been very concerned about mobilizing assistance to make those being deported from the United States welcomed. Do you think that these deportations from the United States to Brazil will affect Brazilian politics in any way?
No, I believe the political impact is minimal. Despite the relevance of images showing Brazilian handcuffs, of course, it's difficult even to be politically exploited. Regarding the deported Brazilians, there are, of course, expressions of solidarity which can be instrumentalized by all political groups. From the perspective of government sectors, the criticism will focus on how these migrants are treated, the abuses committed, and the violations of human rights. Criticism that's reinforced the anti-US feeling that has emerged at various times in Latin America. This also, the Lula government also to serve to highlight Brazil's leadership on the migration issues. It's strange, but Brazil has now a very important leadership in this issue. Positioning it has a reference in migration policy, while it still continues to receive support, whether under the Trump or Biden administration. We have a lot of people came from during the Biden administration. But for the opposition, particularly the far right, of course, there will be no criticism of the way these deportations are carried out or the fact that Brazilians are being deported. And this group aligns with the strong state sovereignty logic. Instead, they use this situation to criticize with the argument that Brazil can support these people, don't provide adequate conditions to them to stay because of lack of job opportunities, violence, and other problems. In this narrative, for this far right, it does not matter that similar mobility patterns exist under previous administration. During the Bolsonaro years, we have the same. A lot of Brazilians leave the country because the same problems, but they want to use this to create a narrative to blame the Lula's government to this situation. I believe this issue cannot break out through polarization bubbles, given its limited importance to most voters. I believe its political impact not is only difficult to leverage, but also has little potential to attract new voters. James, if I can say, I just want to talk a little history. When the images of the deported individuals appear in the media, my mom sent a message to me asking, "What is this? Why this happened?" And after I explained it to her, imagine, I work with migrants and refugees since 2007. My mom is asking me, what? Because deportation, of course. After I explained, the topic never come back in our conversations. It's not a part of the everyday life. The voters have other problems like the price of food and kind of thing. It's difficult to use this in political terms and you use for your bubble.
No, that's a very interesting because it really is a characteristic of the far right in Europe and in the United States, and yet it's not something that works in Brazil, as you point out. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us, João Carlos, today about your research, about what you've learned with Brazil Unfiltered listeners?
My research concentrates in terms of border migration, in terms of to think a new politics in terms of the development in our country, in terms of giving to these migrants rights and a perspective for integration. And if you want to see more about Operation Acolhida and other things developing in Brazil and in South America, you can find us in academia or ResearchGate. And now we are building a comparative perspective in terms of the reception around Latin America. I'm part of a group, the name is Caminar Americas, with a lot of researchers from Uruguay, Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, and now we are developing research in terms of comparative of these countries in terms of reception. Probably in April, we have a new paper with this comparative study.
That's fascinating. Well, I want to thank you, João Carlos, for joining us today on Brazil Unfiltered. It was really wonderful to learn about your research and the situation of immigrants, especially Venezuelan immigrants in Brazil. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Dan.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the interview. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. It helps other people find the program. Have a great week. Until next time, até a próxima.